This is Mary Ebling. I am a transportation policy analyst with the State Smart Transportation Initiative, and I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon. We are still going to give folks a couple of minutes to join in, but I thought that while we were waiting, we could take care of a couple of housekeeping items before we actually start. I'd like everybody to note that attendees are currently muted except for the panelists. And the webinar proceedings will be posted on our website by close of business today, if not earlier. Our website is SSTI.us. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. However, you can submit questions at any point during the presentation by typing your questions into the chat window. If you, for some reason, don't see the question or chat window box, you can click the orange arrow at the top right of your screen and the box will appear that you can type your questions into. So the title of our webinar today is Innovative Sustainable Funding Options for State Departments of Transportation, Issues for Policy and Practice. We've also produced a report for this project that is posted on our website, once again, ssti.us. The report identifies revenue options and assesses the revenue potential. It also assesses modal applicability per revenue option. The report is currently in draft form up on our website, but we expect to have a final edited report on our site in the near future. We will email all of the participants when that final report is available for download. I also would like to extend a thank you to North Carolina DOT for participating in this project, as well as our other state departments of transportation that helped out through responding to surveys of their revenue options that they're currently using. Those DOTs are Arizona, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and Washington. They put significant effort into completing a survey and helped us with our data collection that lets us know what these states were doing as far as use of revenue and desire for possibly pursuing different revenue options. That added great value to this report. I would like to spend a moment introducing our panelists. We have two presenters today. Paul Morris, the Deputy Secretary for Transit for North Carolina Department of Transportation, and Joe Segale, Policy and Planning Manager for Vermont Agency of Transportation, or VTrans. I want to thank them also because they are experiencing some particularly interesting weather with Hurricane Sandy coming through, and we really appreciate their ability to continue on with this presentation. So, Paul Morris, the Deputy Secretary for Transportation, he was appointed to this role in the summer of 2011, and in this role he directs the department's multimodal divisions, including aviation, bicycle and pedestrian transportation, ferry, public transportation, and rail. He also serves as a central point of contact for departmental initiatives involving land use and transportation integration, sustainable community development, and public-private partnerships to help move forward a 21st century transportation system that unlocks economic opportunity and facilitates job creation and improves quality of life for all North Carolinians. Our second presenter is Joe Segale. Mr. Segale is the Planning and Program Manager for Vermont Agency of Transportation. Mr. Segale is a transportation planner and engineer with over 20 years of experience in the public and private sectors. As the lead policy planner for VTrans, Mr. Segale is responsible for preparing major planning policy documents that guide agency spending, decision-making, and effective resource management. He also oversees statewide consultative transportation planning processes involving municipalities and regional planning commissions. Prior to joining VTrans, he worked as a consultant serving clients that included municipalities, regions, states, the National Park Service, and private developers. Mr. Segale is a former select board member in Huntington, Vermont, and serves on the board of directors for the New England Institute of Transportation Engineers. I also would like to introduce a little more about the State Smart Transportation Initiative for those who aren't familiar with us. We are located in Madison, Wisconsin, and we work with CEOs of 20 state departments of transportation to provide a community of practice, which is providing a place focusing on peer-to-peer interactions where the CEOs can talk to their peers and exchange ideas. We also provide technical assistance to our partner states, including in-depth reviews of transportation systems, as well as helping improve tools for planning and analysis. We operate as a resource to the wider transportation community, engaging non-member states through our website, our webinars, And I invite participants to take advantage of these resources that are available on our website. And I'm doing a not so good job at moving the slides. Okay. All right, I wanted to set the stage a little bit for the presentation today on innovative revenue sources, starting with we've been here before. And basically all of the systems, transportation systems that we've developed, have each developed and prospered in their own time. And they've also, during that time, seen a crisis in their funding and business model. Each of them retains currently an important role in our transportation system, so they are still relevant. Highway is now in a crisis for similar reasons. It doesn't mean our roads are irrelevant. We just need to right size and incorporate a multimodal transportation system and figure out how we're going to fund our system. There are several things that are contributing to this crisis. Traditionally, for highway, gas taxes have been historically used to fund the highway system. Those taxes, as you know, are assessed at the pump. There are several variables that are currently operating that are causing the effectiveness of this funding mechanism or business model to decline. I'm going to quickly run through them because I don't want to take too much time from our presenters. But the first one is the reduction in vehicle miles traveled that we're seeing at a national level. That is impacting the amount of available money through our gas tax. Increasing vehicle efficiency, which we're starting to see, but will over the next 10 to 20 years as our fleet turns over become much more operable. So that's also decreasing the amount of revenue coming from our gasoline tax. Simultaneously, we have insufficient indexing of our gas tax. It's not keeping up with the increases in the highway construction price index. So the gas taxes typically in the country, with a few exceptions, are not indexed to the increasing costs. So they do not keep up with inflation. So we see a decline in real revenue from those taxes. So this particular slide kind of shows how everything is working in tandem. If we're seeing reduction in vehicle miles traveled, an increase in efficiency, we're seeing a decline in user fees that we are reaping through the gas tax, and increasing reliance on general purpose revenue or state and local sales taxes that are not necessarily user fee based. So this kind of creates a cascade of problems. Here we see deferred maintenance based on the fact that the dollars aren't available for the maintenance of the transportation system, and we see that it costs more as we move through time. One option is cutting costs potentially. This is what Pennsylvania did. I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but they canceled some of their unneeded projects or postponed based on reassessing their vehicle miles trend. There's also some flexibility that might be attained if we look at our modal silos for how we fund our transportation budgets. These are just a couple of options of how states fund their transportation budgets. All of them are policy decisions, and if your state uses something that's not what you, if it's just gas tax only for highways, the conversation could be had for how you might funnel those dollars differently. In some revenue principles, user fee-based options are often preferable, but there isn't a single solution, and the study didn't find any magic bullet or easy solution. That there's fewer big dollar options, but they're harder to implement. And private capital can be very helpful for project-specific purposes, but it's not necessarily a replacement for longer-term revenue. And I'm not going to talk about these options too much, but some of the directions that we found in our study that I think will be touched on by the other presenters include vehicle miles traveled taxes, increasing gas taxes or carbon taxes, and the others that you see on this slide. And with that, I want to turn it over to Paul Morris, Deputy Secretary of Transit for North Carolina DOT. And I have to go.
Glad to be here and welcome everybody. I want to thank the Sustainable Transportation Initiative for really letting us be a part of this multi-state effort, and in doing so give us a chance to convey some of our own experiences and mine the efforts of others going on around the country and frankly across the globe. For us, we're really pleased to be a part of this process because we really feel like what the Smart State Transportation Initiative is doing helps us explore some pretty innovative and sustainable funding options. gives us a platform to have a conversation outside of the necessary policy arena, and certainly prior to us really getting into the difficult details of choice making. Our intention at NCDOT is to use the information we gather from the report to facilitate and inform our discussions here in North Carolina as we look at how we generate revenue going forward in order to meet our mobility needs, both now and in the future. So for those of you who are listening, it's probably no surprise that it's fair to say, admittedly, this is a complicated and a bit like trying to navigate through a minefield when we have these kind of conversations. We're all facing the challenges that Mary laid out. It's a national challenge. It's one that each state is individually facing somewhat uniquely, but certainly broad-based, especially for us in the arena of securing enough financial resources, funding, and financing to maintain a safe and efficient transportation system. And we do think of our state as being in the business of looking at everything we do globally as a transportation system. In order to effectively address these financial challenges, we understand we need to look at a range of options currently or potentially available to us. We need to assess the opportunities and ultimately make some decisions that meet our unique and particular needs. Like most states, the urgency of needing to identify and institute viable revenue options is great and is growing quickly. Though at the same time, we all understand the sensitivities of additional revenues coming from non-traditional sources. If I could take a moment to talk to you a little bit about some of the things that are going on in North Carolina, maybe to set the stage. We've taken the really bold step in our state for the first time in a very long time, looking all the way out to 2040 and trying to identify, based on our population's growth, which is expected to be 42%, bringing our total population to about 13.5 million. Nearly 75% of that population will live in our existing urban areas, and almost 20% of the population will be older than 65 years of age. Those alone are significant drivers of change that are really forcing us to think differently about how we fund and what we fund. That means that our transportation needs will have to increase, and the preferences of how North Carolinians move about is going to have to change as well. We have to be prepared fiscally, we know, in our state for our growing and changing demographic if we're going to be able to remain a nationally and competitive state. So the overarching objective, North Carolina's main objective, is to ensure that we are meeting the mobility needs of our citizens both now and in the future. We have a policy that says that we're here to enhance the mobility, the safety, and efficiency of our transportation system. And in the last year, as a result of a lot of efforts from the grassroots on up and through our staff to our board, we increased that thinking to really look at the health, safety, and economy, well-being of our population. To that end, we really recognize that in order to be successful, we have to be a part of a process that ensures that it's a joint effort looking at funding at both the state and local level. We recognize that our system, as all modes are concerned, has the potential to affect the health and quality of life for those who live here. And as we think about it economically, we recognize that while this DOT is technically in the transportation business, everything we do, we increasingly recognize impacts our economy and therefore requires a collaborative effort to address it. This has really been drilled into the day-to-day workings of our business and resulted in how we begin to identify metrics for measurement through a data-driven decision-making process in all our transportation funding decisions, as well as project prioritization, which is based on input from all of our MPOs and RPOs across the state. Now, having understood that we're looking out 30 years and setting that context to try to think about who's involved and what are we trying to do, it's important that I help you understand a little bit more as I drill down how and why we're exploring revenue options for the state. The bar chart that's in front of you reflects our recently adopted 2040 plan, and it defines what is needed in order to meet those future demands for all forms of transportation, including our roadways, railways, busways, waterways, walkways, airways, every mode we move. The plan estimates how much it will actually cost to meet those needs and compares it to how much actual revenue we will be able to generate in future years. And it pays attention to those needs in a way that actually correlates with our available funding mechanisms. The graphic, as you can see, depicts that the state and federal revenues over the next 30 years will, on the blue bar, generate approximately $54 million, or $54 billion, excuse me, during that time period. For comparison purposes, we went through the process of identifying, as a part of the 30-year funding need, 3 different levels of need, or 3 different scenarios for growth and accommodation. One that enable us to maintain what we currently have, so we can continue to believe and demonstrate that we are a good road state, which is our banner headline for much of our state's history. 2, in the second bar, that we go the next step and we try to create a better system, admittedly constrained in how we grow our capacity and accommodation based on our current availability and pipeline of projects and funding for the system. And thirdly, that we look out to the future based on the growth needs and the competitive positioning we are driving for to create the best system, essentially to create the capacity to lead. And as you can see, over the 30-year period, we have a very large shortfall, starting at $40 billion in the good condition, growing to $68 billion in the better condition, and $106 billion for the best system. Now, it's probably useful to say that the expected revenues of this 30-year projection are approximately $4 billion per year available after all of our transfer programs, such as construction, maintenance, and operations. Obviously, due to inflation, buying power is going to be lost over time. We are a state that, for many, is somewhat unique in that we oversee the large majority of all of our transportation modes. We have approximately 79,000 miles of highway and local roadway under our control, which constitutes more than 80% of all roads in North Carolina, 6 intercity passenger trains, 2 trains that we actually provide funding for by the state, as well as trains that we work with Amtrak to operate for us. We are responsible for overseeing over 3,300 miles of rail, 2 marine ports and 2 inland ports, 21 ferries on 7 ferry routes, the second largest system in the country, 72 publicly owned airports, including 9 commercial aviation centers, over 300 private airports, 62 million passengers annually operating on 99 transit systems across the state, and over 3,000 miles of bicycle routes that are unique and dedicated outside of our Complete Streets programs. So as you can appreciate, North Carolina has a very diverse, a very large transit system, and somewhat opportunistically as a state gives us an opportunity to think systematically and holistically about our funding discussions. Acknowledging these challenges, our Board of Transportation and our State General Assembly have expressed increasing interest in exploring options for generating revenues to meet the needs. At the present time, we're in the process of gathering a lot of information and reinvigorating a conversation about revenue options that had started off and on some years ago. We've already had a number of important conversations with policymakers across the state, and that information and the work that SSTI has put together is going to help us to provide, hopefully, somewhat more unbiased information base for us to really be able to have an informed dialogue. it's going to be critical in North Carolina for us to understand the full range of our options, the revenue potential, a lot of the pros and cons, thinking about policy and practice implications, and more importantly than anything, looking to our other state neighbors for the best case examples of what worked and what failed, or what they've tried to assess the support for any options implementation. Admittedly, MAP 21 at the federal level has added a new complexity to our conversations, and it really remains to be seen to what extent federal changes in legislation may either open up further revenue sources or options, even flexibility in how we fund, or potentially curtail them. I'd also like to add that we're continuing to keep an eye on revenue options because in many cases our circumstances are changing at a pace that is prompting us to have to go back and reevaluate our actions as we go. So as we go forward, the study that SSTI conducted gives us really a good resource to serve as a way for us to understand the range of strategies that really others are using across the country without bias. The report has provided us in our internal dialogue and fiscal analysis some detailed information that has become useful in evaluating specific strategies. And obviously it provides some information that is critical to us, including not only what the sources are, but describing how they work, how they could grow and generate revenue over time. To some extent, how the revenue has been generated or assigned to individual modes versus transportation system-wide, and the case studies of other states and the successes or failures that they've experienced in applying them. I guess we would say the report could best be described for us as a catalog of revenue strategies and options. Now, it's important for me to frame for you how this has begun to shake out in our conversation. And I've categorized this, I guess, a bit as a philosophical discussion. Everything we're talking about here has policy implications that have both practical and political consequences. This is really where we are spending much of our time. We're thinking about the conversation with a lot of individual interests, and we're using this work to really begin to inform a conversation that will help us deliberate, not just at the state level, but how we will deliberate in our conversations up to the federal government and their agencies, as well as down into the details of our local communities, towns, cities, counties, metropolitan and rural planning organizations. If I could start somewhat kind of at a high level philosophically, what I would tell you is that we're thinking about this somewhat in the abstract to begin with, which makes it more of a philosophical discussion. In a sense, what we might be asking about our state's interests is what are our values and how do we want to build our portfolio of revenue to meet them? Are we looking for, and these are some questions that we're asking ourselves, high, medium, or low revenue potential, or a mix of choices from any source that we want to pursue going forward? And does the strategy of providing a large amount of revenue in the short term make sense, or does it make more sense to think how we might generate revenue in small increments over a steady period of time? A lot of times what it calls us to do is think about the generation of funds from multiple modes and multiple sources. So then the question becomes, are there restrictions to us, both at the state and federal level, for how these funds can be used or how we would want them to be applied? And if they aren't there today, would those restrictions be something that might be generated due to the course of debate? A lot of who benefits from the revenues or how they are then allocated becomes integral to our thinking. In a sense, we've asked the question, does the allocation of not just our current but future funding sources provide more benefit to the public, or increasingly in an economic development-minded world to the private sector? Does that mean that we look at public-private partnerships in which we're actually soliciting and attracting the private sector to carry more of the load in making these transportation improvements possible? Are revenues generated predominantly from the public, or in fact, is it private funding, not just financing, that actually is taking on transportation funding again, as it was early in the last century? Or is it a combination? And then really at the end of the day for us, there's this kind of bang for the buck or return on investment, implying that how easy it is to implement something would be helpful, so long as that the amount of revenue we generate is meaningful. We don't want to get ourselves into a situation where, because it seems easy from a public perception standpoint and yet difficult to implement, we end up with revenue sources that are insufficient. In many cases, we recognize this will change legislation or policy that will be required, and that the public support for that implementation is going to have to be generated from day one. We can't really come out with plans. We've got to develop a dialogue and an understanding on a very basic level across our state what it means to provide sustainable transportation funding for what we have, to maintain it, improve it, and in some cases rebuild it after it has exhausted its useful life, as well as to think seriously about what key components of our transportation system are essential for us to grow. There are no right or wrong answers to all of these questions, but how a particular state or transportation agency answers them may ultimately yield the kind of options that deserve further consideration. I'd like to just share with you very quickly some examples of some things we're trying to do in real time as we start to look at various scenarios. In North Carolina, currently, we are focused primarily on our gas tax, but increasingly on looking at user fee approaches to enhancing, expanding, and filling out the full funding equation. We're also using some other innovative revenue-generating options that include value capture, a project called the Red Line Regional Rail Project, which is actually a link to a light rail project in Charlotte, North Carolina, commuter rail project that essentially uses value capture from real estate returns off of the public improvement to actually fund the program. In this particular case, the project would actually generate about $226 million, or 50% of a $452 million project. The idea being that the local governments, working in concert with the regional and the state government, would actually fully fund the project for capital and operation costs over 30 years. This would be done through a public-private partnership that could eventually include designing, building, operating, financing, and maintaining considerations. What's unique about this is that the New York bond underwriting community is actually evaluating the project rather than local constituents who are either campaigning for or championing a particular investment. The idea being that if the outside markets believe that this is a viable way to build infrastructure and achieve net benefit and economic return, then it actually has a legitimate chance of being a source that the private sector would endorse, ultimately want to fund, and would receive benefit from having done. The second project I'll just briefly describe for you is the Charlotte Gateway Intermodal Station, which takes some of the same elements of value capture through tax increment financing and special assessments, and really looks at a very clean, clear-cut approach of situation where we at the DOT, through a special legislation, acquired 10 city blocks alongside and at the core of what would be the future major intermodal rail and transit center. Doing that for the purposes of early on setting a low base of value, and as the value grew, reaching a point where the value exceeded the cost of building the project, and therefore made it possible for the real estate that we had acquired to be leased and or sold in order to actually build the capital improvements. So in this case, unlike the Red Line, where we're admittedly looking at a future speculation on growth, in the Charlotte Gateway Station, we're actually letting the growth occur before we build the infrastructure. And in Union Station, we're really looking at a whole suite of public-public partnerships where we're really saying to the local governments and the private sector, you need to come to the table early on with funding that would make it possible for us to fund the overall project. In this particular case, the city of Raleigh went out and sold bonds or passed a referendum for bonds that allowed them to generate approximately $6 million or 10% of a $60 million new project, was then able to secure a Tiger grant, and then was able to work with us and Triangle Transit to secure the property, existing building, and other federal and state funding to finish out the project. There are a number of other projects I could share with you, but that gives you a snapshot of some of the innovative ways that we're trying to think, I'll call it outside the traditional box, to really look at ways in which we can advance our funding equation and come alongside some of the great work that we've been able to be a part of at SSTI. Thank you very much. And when it's time, I'm happy to take some questions. Mary, back to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm now going to turn it over to Joe Segale from VTrans. So I'm just going to, Joe, give you control of the mouse, and if you would click in your slide presentation, that'll give you control over the, hold on a second, Joe. Okay, we're good. You just need to click on your presentation.
Okay. There it is. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Joe Segale. I'm the Manager of Policy and Planning at the Vermont Agency of Transportation, and I'm really pleased to be with you all this afternoon. And we, too, have been working with the State Smart Transportation Initiative, and they've been helping us out on a study that we started working on this summer. It was actually required by our state legislature to look at funding options in the next 5 years, identify what our needs are, what the gap is, and identify revenue sources that are feasible to implement within that window, while also taking a look at some long-term needs and issues. And we have actually been referencing the North Carolina report, and Mary and Eric Sundquist from SSTI came up and met with our committee of legislators and others, and it was really quite valuable because they were able to talk about what else was going on around the country and help our folks here see that we're not necessarily unique in the challenges that we're facing. So what I'm going to do is really kind of draw off the work that we've done for that study and give you a little bit of information about Vermont and how we fund transportation now and what our needs and challenges are and the options that we're considering and where we're going with this study. It's due, official report is due to the legislature in January. Our legislators come back January 1st, and they're usually in session for about 6 months. And we're actually quite lucky that on this committee we have a senator who sits on the Senate Transportation Committee and is also, she's the vice chair of that committee, and she's the chair of appropriations. And we have a representative who sits on the House Transportation Committee, as well as the Secretary of Transportation and others that are involved in these decisions. So it was pretty interesting for me to see the description of North Carolina's transportation system, which is probably an order of magnitude bigger than Vermont's system. Overall, you could add a 0 or 2 zeros to almost all these figures that I just put up there on the screen. Our population in Vermont is about 620,000 for the 2010 census. So we're small, we're a rural state, we're really, we have a lot of small, compact village centers and downtowns surrounded by open countryside. A lot of us, like myself, live out in the country and commute into these centers, but once we're in the centers, we have a lot of options to move around, and we're actually, in recent years, building a pretty good network of commuting transit routes between the major population and employment centers. So the Agency of Transportation takes care of about 3,000 miles of roads on the state system, and we have about 3,000 bridges, 1,300 short structures, and some unknown quantity of culverts, which we learned about in great detail when Irene came through last year. We also support the municipalities. Most of the local road system is supported by the property taxes, but we provide grant programs that fund their system as well. We have 50 or so park and ride facilities, and in Vermont, that pretty much means you park there and you grab a ride with others. You share a ride in another car. And if you ever look at the definition of what a park and ride is, and AASHTO has a guideline on that, you'll see it's where you pick up a train or a bus. But in Vermont, it's a little bit more informal than that, although some of our park and rides do have bus service. We have bike and ped program, but unlike North Carolina, we don't really own or maintain extensive bike networks. We do have one long rail trail in the northern part of the state, but that's relatively new. Mostly we fund bike and ped programs that are in infrastructure that's implemented on the local level. We have a public transit program, and there's 10 public transit agencies around the state, and we administer the grants and work with them and provide funding through various programs. We own 310 miles of rail line. We also fund the operation of Amtrak in 2 of those corridors, and we own 10 airports. So our general funding sources in Vermont, typically about 40 or 50% of our transportation funding comes from the federal government, and the balance comes from some form of state revenue. When Irene came through, that kind of bumped up the federal pod, and ERA did that as well. And I think it's actually a little more useful to look at what's been happening since 2007. And 2007 and 2008, our total budget was about $420 to $450 million a year. And you can kind of see that even split between state and federal funds. When ERA came along, it really bumped that up. And then again, when Irene came along, we've seen a surge in federal funds in this last year, which obviously only helps us rebuild where we were. It doesn't get us, that's really not obviously any new capacity. But we realize that this level of federal funding is not going to continue in the future. You can see the blue down below is the state transportation fund, and I'll go over the various sources for that. And it's more or less flat, and it stayed flat, and any time that it's gone up has not necessarily been due to state gas taxes. It's been adjustments made to other fees. It's sort of like indexing of the other fees, but the legislature considers fees every 3 years for the transportation fund. This is a closer look at the source of revenue for our state transportation funds, and the gas tax is about 30% of it, gas and diesel tax. Motor vehicle fees also about 30% of it. We have something, it's called the Transportation Infrastructure Bond Fund, TIP Fund, which is really a 2% sales tax on gasoline and another 3 cents per gallon on diesel. And it was passed by the legislature back in 2010. And it passed kind of quickly. I mean, essentially it was raising gas taxes, but it wasn't presented that way. And I think it passed at the end of the session quickly on a floor vote, so there wasn't a lot of discussion of it in committees and so on, and the media necessarily wasn't all over it. And it was actually passed while we had a Republican governor. In Vermont, we had a Republican governor for 8 years, and just recently in 2010, we have a Democratic governor. But even the Republican governor saw the need for more revenue for transportation funds and supported this. Something also that happens in Vermont, and maybe I'm sure in other states, is for the purchase and use tax, which is about 25% of our state transportation fund. That's actually a pretty big chunk, but a third of that actually is diverted to our state education fund. So while you can certainly make a connection between people buying vehicles and their use, it's not as direct as gasoline or VMT and so on. It still gets diverted, and that's one of the things we are going to have a discussion about. Is that really the proper use of that revenue source? And of course, you can't just divert that and not expect the funds to be raised someplace else. But it's something that we want to think about. We have this great need in transportation, yet the revenue that's being collected related to transportation gets diverted. Just a little bit closer look at some of our, the typical funding sources. Our gasoline tax, at least the excise part of it, is 20 cents per gallon. If you add in the 2% TIB assessment, it's actually pretty close to 28 cents per gallon, which is the U.S. average. And our diesel tax as well is about 26 cents per gallon, but if you add in the TIB assessment, we're pretty close to what's happening on average. I think there's a little bit of misconception about that by some folks who think there's some room to raise the gas tax, if at least you're looking at other states, but in reality, we're right in the middle on that particular issue. Some of the very specific DMV fees are listed below. There's a really long list, as I'm sure you all can imagine. It's probably similar in other states. But one of the things we're highlighting is our basic annual auto registration fee is much less than the national average, and so there might be an opportunity there to raise it and not feel like we're treating our citizens any different than other folks around the country. I think we do a pretty good job of distributing our funds amongst all the modes. For such a small rural state, we do try to fund across modes, and Paul was mentioning his strategic plan. We have one as well, and that does guide our funding decisions, and that's why you see this split here. And we want to keep on doing this. Still, the biggest portion of this is focused on roads and bridges, maintaining those roads and bridges. We don't do a lot of big capacity projects in Vermont, big highway capacity projects. We've had a few that are sort of legacy projects that have been out there for a long while. Recently, we had one project that was a ring road around our largest city. It's been on the books for probably 40 years, and this governor finally said, look, we can't keep fighting this battle, and we've pulled that money back, and now we're looking at different mobility options within those corridors to try to address the same needs that folks figured the highway was justified for. So in terms of our needs overall, one of the things we did as part of the study is we tried to take a closer look at our basic infrastructure needs. And for bridges, we looked at what's the life cycle needs of bridges. When do we need to rehab the deck? When do we need to replace the bridge overall? And how often should we be doing preventative maintenance? And what do all those things cost? And we have a good database, like most states, on what the condition of our bridges are, when's the last time they were worked on, what sort of work was done, and we were able to develop a pretty decent projection of bridge needs over the next 20 years. And what we see is this surge of bridges coming down the line, where if you average it out, it's not so bad, but if you really want to keep up and stay ahead of these needs, we're going to need a big burst of funds sooner than what we anticipated. We're still kind of averaging it out just for the sense of getting order of magnitude and what our funding gap is, but it helps make the case that we do need new revenue, and we might need it sooner rather than later. Some other issues that we've been thinking about is the interstate in Vermont was built in the 60s and the 70s, and most of it is approaching about 50 years old. In general, we've been typical paving rehabilitation of the interstate, but we're going to be looking at more major reconstruction down through the base, and that's going to cost a lot of money. So we have this great piece of infrastructure, which in my opinion has done great things for our economy. It's connected Vermont to the rest of the Northeast, and it's really helped support our tourist economy as well as other industries that have located here. So we can't let that piece of infrastructure go, and we have to make a commitment to keeping it open. And I think MAP 21, through its emphasis on the NHS, is really going to support that even further. So I think we're not going to have a choice. We're going to have to rebuild major sections of the interstate. Another incredibly important issue for us, which we learned last year, was resiliency. How are we going to build our system so that it can withstand these storms, which, hopefully this isn't a yearly event. We have Sandy kind of coming up the coast, and it looks like it's going to circle right around us, and we're going to be okay, at least from a flooding perspective. But we do expect more frequent and intense storms up here, and we're really thinking about how can we strategically invest in our transportation system to address those high-risk areas, and going through a climate adaptation process that FHWA has outlined, trying to get the money to do that, and I think we will do it. But I think with resiliency, we're going to try to do it with the funds that we have available, and it's really about priorities. We just have to make sure that we're strategic about it and put the money where it can do the best for us. As I mentioned previously, we do provide funding directly to the municipalities. They get a direct allocation based on road miles, but they also, there's a couple competitive grant programs that we provide. And we get twice as many applications as we have money for. So there is a real need out there, and as I alluded to earlier, what happens on the local system is when we can't provide funds from the State Transportation Fund, which are tied pretty much directly to some type of transportation source, it ends up being paid for on the property tax, and that's a huge issue for us in Vermont. It's a common complaint that our local property taxes are too high. We support philosophically transit and rail in this state. Our population supports it, or at least the majority of them support it. And we're really hoping to get rail service up into Montreal. You know, I see that as maybe the interstate version of rail. It's like if we can make that connection to these major metropolitan areas, that's going to continue to support our economy. And we do support bicycle pedestrian investments. And you know, we documented, our partners at the regional planning commissions documented about $100 million in need. And you know, to put that in perspective, our annual budget is $500 million. So there's real demand for bike and ped use around the state as well. Some of the challenges for a small state like us, the two legislators on the committee, you know, when we presented the information about our funding gap, it was somewhat eye-opening to them, and they thought, well, you have to help us, you know, make the case for raising revenues. And so I've started thinking about that a little bit. I haven't made great progress in that yet, but I started thinking about, well, what's the relative burden on Vermonters of our state transportation fund? And this chart just shows where are we in terms of the state transportation fund versus what our gross domestic product is as a state, and we're kind of up on the upper end. We're about average for rural states, but the average kind of lies a little bit when you start looking at the ranking here. We're kind of near the top. So even though, you know, for those larger states that are out there, we greatly appreciate the fact that we get, you know, more federal revenue back than we kick in to the Highway Trust Fund. We're still relatively burdened here in Vermont compared to other states on our economy, and also looked at it on a per capita basis, and it's kind of the same thing. And you know, I guess we all make decisions and we choose to live in certain places, but for us rural states, this is, I guess, just a fact of life. It's a little bit more expensive to live here. We do think, you know, we are an important part of the overall system. We certainly are on the border, and I hope people see the importance in that as well. So where we stand on the study right now is the gap analysis that we did shows that we need about $200 to $250 million more a year just to meet basic needs, to deal with that bridge surge, to rebuild the interstate, to maintain the level of transit and rail that we're providing. And again, that's relative to a budget that's about $500 million per year. So it's not in the billions as in North Carolina, but the relative need is still about the same. And it kind of makes me wonder if that's like a consistent proportion across the country. My guess is it's probably something on that order of magnitude. And as I mentioned, the legislators on our committee are really open-minded about this and thinking about how can we make the case. And we're starting we're starting a parallel study now to look at what the economic implications are of not closing the funding gap. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this particular study, but we're hoping to have that information together before the legislature comes back. And you know, we're going to be developing some scenarios of if we have to close this number of bridges, and you know, we're going to invest in the interstate and in the national highway system, but we're going to have to let some of the other roads go. We can do some modeling. We do have a statewide travel demand modeling that we're going to make some estimates of where bridges might fail and how that might affect the overall network and travel time. And that information is going to go into an economic input-output model, and we're going to see what it does to jobs and income and so on. But they really need that information to make the case. You know, there's definitely some qualitative descriptions that we can provide them: rougher roads, posted-in or closed bridges, increased costs due to deferred maintenance. I wish we really had a sophisticated asset management system in place. We've been working towards that, but we don't have it fully integrated yet so that we can tweak things and say if we invest X, this will be the result on performance. I know that's been the gold standard, and certainly that's probably the direction we have to go with MAP 21, but we aren't there yet. So at least in Vermont and other states I've talked to aren't quite there yet either. And maybe that's one of the benefits of MAP 21 is it's really going to push us all in that direction, because whether we like it or not, funding decisions are going to be made like that. I like it. I think it's the right thing to do, but we just don't have the systems in place. And I think it's probably because we do what we need to do each year with capital programming. We work on our projects, and then we move forward. I think some of the other consequences are there's going to be pressure not to fund bike, ped, and non-automotive modes. in our state where 90+% of all trips are made in cars, and a lot of rural states, that's just natural. And it's probably, there's going to be pressure to put it back on the locals, particularly bike and ped type projects. So I don't know if that's a dire enough picture. I personally would like to have some more numbers to put at it, particularly the economic impact, and I'm hoping we'll get there by the end of the year and have that information available, which might be worthwhile for others as well. Some of the funding options that we're thinking about, and my first bullet is when we got to that $200 to $250 million gap, it's like we can't afford that on our own. And the legislators in the room, that was really their conclusion. I mean, there was sort of dead silence. And when they started thinking about what our total budget is as a state, which is closer to $2 billion, it's in that order of magnitude, this is a huge amount, and it's certainly a huge amount relative to our transportation budget. We'd have to we collect about $200 million a year just in state transportation funds, so we'd have to a little bit more than double what we're collecting from Vermonters if we were going to close that gap on our own. And so, we're thinking that it's some mix. We need to have skin in the game. We can't just look to the federal government and say, you've got to close this gap for us. So some of the options that we're thinking are, quite frankly, they're not that innovative. And as we've been working on this and talking about it here, I'm like, geez, can't we come up with something really new and exciting? And the answer is no. I mean, and maybe we need to be somewhat honest about that, because I think sometimes just talking about there's innovative ways to get around this skirts the real issue. And we looked at numbers. The Highway Trust Fund, if the federal gas tax had kept pace with inflation, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. And I know that's a really difficult conversation to have. I like the way Paul has been, is setting up their discussion to frame it. What are our values? What is it we really want to achieve? I think that's quite useful. But the facts are the facts. So we're providing kind of a menu of options and what the legislators can get for unit cost increase in each one of these. For example, if you raise the gas tax by 1 cent in Vermont, that raises $3.6 million. Really a small amount of money, but it's important for them to understand that. In Vermont, if we had kept our gas tax indexed to inflation, and we haven't raised it since the 1990s as well, that would generate another $50 million a year. And so it's important, I think, for decision makers to have that information. We have been talking about a mileage-based user fee, and a VMT tax in and of itself is not going to solve the revenue problem. I think it's got a lot of great benefits to it in terms of policy decisions and trying to affect people's behavior and so on. And I think in the long term, it's probably the right direction to go. But you still need to raise enough money even with mileage-based user fees. And so it's a little bit of a distraction from the real issue, I feel, but it has a lot of value, and we're probably going to recommend that we need to think about pursuing that. In Vermont, because we're a small state, we can't really do it on our own. We have people traveling through our state. It needs to be some kind of coalition, whether it's in New England or the Northeast or so on. And the I-95 Corridor Coalition has done some work on that and how the mechanics of money shift between one state or another. And it's a really rich area to talk about, but it's really it comes down to policy in my mind. It's not so much about whether or not we can do it. Of course we can do it if we really want to do it. We're going to look at increasing registration fees, of course, as I pointed out. Varying fees by vehicle size and weight is something we're crunching some numbers on. One of the real things that's going on right now, it's sort of related to value capture. I put the two things together. It's what we're calling fair share or value capture. And many of you know that municipalities are able to charge impact fees for development. And there has to be a nexus between the projects that they're paying for and the amount of traffic or other travel demand that they're generating. The developers have to benefit from the projects that are being paid for with the impact fees. And it's a pretty good way, I think, to encourage planning for transportation and what sort of projects and what sort of multimodal projects do we want for an area, and then how to distribute those costs. And so that works fairly well on the local level when the municipalities want to do it. On a statewide level, we haven't found an example, and if anybody else has some examples, out there on how they're doing it, I'd love to hear it. But we're studying this now, and we're trying to develop a system where the state, not just municipalities, can somehow capture the value when we invest in capacity projects that allow development to continue. And we have a statewide land use permitting process in Vermont called Act 250, and our agency participates in those. And typically, we do a regular traffic impact study review and suggest some mitigation. But lately, we've been asking developers to contribute to larger plans, and we can only go so far with that under our current state statutes. Once we build a project, we can't retroactively ask developers to contribute to that project, even though they're going to be consuming the capacity. So we're working on that. We're getting a lot of interest in that because we actually are asking people to pay. And if you want to get interest in something, start charging folks for using the transportation system. And we have a big meeting coming up next week. Legislators have all gotten very interested in this because they've been getting calls. So we're kind of, it's planning and action, I guess I will call it. So we're learning from that experience, but we realize we're also going to be developing a more systematic system, a systematic approach to how we do this. We have another study going on that was originally attached to this current study that's looking at how to collect fees from alternative fuel vehicles, primarily electric vehicles. Some legislators felt like electric vehicles were getting a free ride since they weren't buying gasoline and weren't paying gas taxes. They're still paying the other 60% of the fees that go into our transportation fund, but there was this sense that they're not contributing. We have a comprehensive energy plan in the state that got passed just last year, and it's pretty ambitious, and it calls for 90% renewables in 50 years, and for the transportation sector by 2030, 25% of vehicles. The goal is to have 25% of vehicles alternative fuel vehicles. So this does have the potential to further impact our revenues. So we are looking at some different funding options. There's only about 80 electric vehicles currently registered in Vermont right now, and so the feeling is, well, since the numbers are so low, now's the time to get a system in place. And of course, we're thinking of the VMT fee for that, and a simple approach is just upping their registration fees. But a more innovative approach is to charge per kilowatt hour that electric vehicles use. So when they're charging either at home or some other public charging station, we're trying to figure out how can we capture and charge them for the electricity that they're using. At home, we're starting to implement smart meters in Vermont, and so that provides an opportunity to collect some fees. This is not going to close our funding gap by any means, but in the long term, it's something that we're trying to make a structural change, I guess, now, so that we can make sure we can capture that as we get more and more electric vehicles. I think really mileage-based user fees is probably the simpler way. This is probably a case where mileage-based user fees is simpler than some other methodology. The evaluation criteria that we're using are very similar to the ones that Paul showed earlier. We're thinking of revenue stream considerations, what the potential is, how sustainable are they, how flexible are they in terms of can they be used for different modes and so on. And in Vermont, all of our state transportation funds can be used for all modes. That's one advantage that we have here. Implementation and administration considerations, of course. We've had just a brief discussion about public acceptance and political viability, and we'll take a shot at addressing that, but I think the people on our committee are really going to be able to provide some great input. And it looks like we're almost running out of time. So those are our criteria, and where we're going next is the summary is that it's the big funding gap versus a little state. That's kind of where we're at. There's no silver bullets. We're looking at different options in a 5-year time frame. In the longer term, I think mileage-based user fees is probably where we'd like to go. We think it's a great policy level. And then just to repeat, we can't do it alone. So that's it. Thanks. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thanks very much, Joe. I think what I would like to do is, first of all, thank both of our presenters for your excellent presentations today. I would also like to encourage participants, if they have not already, to type questions into the chat box so we can ask them of our presenters. I wanted to also mention that we have an upcoming webinar on bus rapid transit on November 29th at 1 p.m. Central Time, 2 p.m. Eastern. And I think I'm going to go to the questions now. Yeah, we just have the one question. This is for Joe in Vermont. What is the source of the funding for your $8.8 million year bicycle and pedestrian projects?
It's a combination of federal funds. It was actually previously the Transportation Enhancement Program, which is no longer in existence, and then we match that with the state funds and local funds, like 10% state funds, 10% local funds.
Okay.
And actually, we also funded it through our STP program as well.
Okay, I know we're kind of running short on time, so I think I'll wrap it up. And if you have a question that you think about later, you can go ahead and shoot emails to the presenters and ask it of them. And I once again want to thank everybody for joining, and have a great rest of your day.